Thank you so much for joining us for this session on navigating constituent interactions. So this session is going to be geared in large part toward those of you who will be answering phones in congressional offices, but our speaker today will cover some tips for communicating in difficult situations that are applicable to any role you will find yourself in over the course of your career, no matter where that takes you. Today, we are so pleased to have joining us Dr. Brian Baird. Dr. Baird served 12 years in Congress as representative for Washington's 3rd District. But before that, he also received a doctorate in clinical psychology. And I'm not kidding, Dr. Baird literally wrote the book on internships in the psychology world, as well as working with interns in Congress. So he has a wealth of experience on what you're going through or what you will be going through soon. Since leaving Congress, he has also provided training to congressional staff and interns, in particular during the pandemic and after January 6th. He's also recently launched the Democracy Not Violence Pledge, working to create a more civil, productive atmosphere for politics. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of this session, so at any time during this webinar, please use the Q&A function to tell us what's on your mind or ask a question, and we'll try to get to everyone by the end of the session. Dr. Baird, take it away.
Ann, thank you so much, and it's so nice to see everyone who's part of this. So Ann was kind enough to do a brief introduction. I won't reiterate it here. Those are some of the things I've done, but in the end, it's not just the things I've done, but it's why I did them and how I did them that matters. And that should be a lesson for you in your training as an intern and whatever you do professionally. What is your motive for doing what you're doing? And are you doing it to the best of your ability and with dignity and integrity and courage and honesty? So I want to start with what I consider the single most important rule of politics. And I would ask you to, before I tell you the answer, at least what I think the answer is, ask yourself what you think it is. What do you think that as you go into this internship or to whatever career you go into, what's the single most important rule of politics? Okay, next slide. We'll show you what I think the answer is. We are here to serve the public and the nation. We are servants of the public. We're not there to advance our own careers. Yes, that's part of our calculus and part of our consideration. And it is normal for us all to do that. But that's not what should drive us. At every moment, I should say, is what I'm doing serving the public and the nation? And notice that I'm not saying, is it serving my political agenda? Is it serving my partisan agenda? Is it making me better? Is it serving the public? So I'm going to share with you a couple things that were not always taught in school. Years ago, when I literally wrote the internship and practicum field placement handbook, I thought, we're sending young people out to work in clinical settings. I'm a neuropsychologist by training, and they've got a lot of classroom knowledge, but not some of the basic skills they may need to succeed in the real clinical workplace where we sent them. And the same is somewhat true of your internship. You may have taken a number of courses in college or had other life experiences, but two skills that people often don't teach and they're not prepared when they come to Congress are strong communication skills. You may think you've got them, and you may, but not everyone does. And then also how to take care of yourself. So we're going to kind of blast through two topics that I sometimes cover in a full day seminar. We'll see if we can do it in about 20 minutes. So I've developed over years of training interns and clinicians and my own clinical practice and my work as a politician, frankly, a model of communication that I find kind of helpful. And I call it the 6R model. The R is not a political R in this case. It stands for the initial letter of the words that you're about to see. And a key point of this is each of us develops an unconscious mechanism of how we communicate, our gestures, our tone of voice, our pacing, our words we use, mostly unconscious. They just kind of come out. But that's not what we need to do if we're going to be advanced communicators. We need to think about how we're speaking and why and how we're receiving information. So let's proceed to the model. First is going to be a graphic. These are the 6 R's: readiness, receiving, relating, reasoning, responding, and repeating. And they're in this pattern because they're ongoing throughout a conversation. Let me go into each one of these, and I'll suggest to you that this is not just about what you do in your internship, especially when you're interacting with constituents, but if you apply these in your private life, I think you'll find it very helpful in your relationships. I continually get letters from folks who've been in my workshops, and I do national trainings with law firms and others, who say, you know what, that has saved my marriage. I can finally go home for the holidays and not argue with my family. I'm working better with my spouse or my kids. So this can apply to a lot of settings, but it can be really handy, especially if you're dealing with constituents who have needs. So the first R is readiness. So what do I mean by readiness? Most of us just sort of jump into a communication. We're always, we're just always ready to go, but we haven't prepared for that. Readiness means I'm going to quiet my mind, get rid of whatever else was in there. I'm going to not apply my habitual response, my communication pattern, and I'm going to try to meet people where they are. Let me give you one example of readiness. Let's suppose you've had a really, really tough day at work, and you come home to your partner or your family or your significant other or your roommates, and your head is filled with junk. If you don't get rid of that junk before you come into the room, you just carried a lot of junk into your relationship that was not there to begin with. So can you quiet your mind and take just a second, whether it's in the driveway, when you get off the metro, when you're walking in the door, quiet your mind and be present with the people who are there. Where this can happen a lot, I mean a lot in a single day in a congressional office, is you deal with one constituent. Maybe it's somebody who's really angry and doesn't like what your boss did. That's fine. You've got to listen to them, be respectful, be responsive. But maybe the next person is losing a loved one due to COVID. How can you clear your head from that first communication to be ready to respond to the next communication, which is completely different? And you may need to do that. It's not exactly an on and off switch, but it's a kind of a clear the screen, close the screen for every single communication step you have. So that's the first step. If we're not quiet and ready for this communication, what we're doing is bringing in lots of other stuff from habits and from what came before. The next R is receiving. And receiving is not just listening. We tend to think when we're receiving that we're just getting the words. I want to hear what the person is saying. And if I hear it accurately, well, I've just received their message. But no, you need to receive how they're saying it. What is their tone of voice? What is their pacing? What has come before? If you're in a person in one-on-one meeting or even on a Zoom, what's their body language telling you? To receive fully, you have to be totally attentive. Now, here's a kind of an amazing thing. I've been doing these workshops for years. I've been a clinical psychologist for decades. And I've come to realize that the numbers of times in my daily life, in my clinical work, I'm pretty good at this. But in my daily life, the numbers of times I am not fully present, whether it's with my wife, with my kids, with my coworkers. I sit down with my kids and they're talking to me and I'm thinking, okay, I got to get that PowerPoint ready for internal palooza. And then after that, I've got a meeting with a reporter and there's my kid trying to talk to me. I'm not fully present. Try being absolutely fully engaged. Eye contact, ears open, attentiveness to what you're feeling. It's kind of freaky. You don't do it very often, but it's really tremendously important. And really powerful communicators are completely present, fully receiving what the person is conveying. This is incredibly important. It's relating. We often think, especially in our professional roles like members of Congress, congressional staffers, interns, I'm going to hear what they're saying, decode the facts of their statement, give them a factual answer, and that's what the conversation is all about. But the emotional content can be just as important, maybe more important, and relating to people emotionally can be at least as important as the content. Let me give you an example of how it didn't work. My father died of a disease called pulmonary fibrosis. He literally died in my arms. I was working with a member of Congress after I left Congress, so we were in an advocacy role. And I was with a very dear friend who had the same disease that killed my father. So here's a man who is dying of a disease, a man who's a colleague from Congress who has lost his father to the disease. And we were telling a congressional staffer, a legislative director, in fact, about this and why we needed more research funding for this disease. After listening to the story, the legislative director said something to this effect. Well, I can tell you right now that given the schedule in Congress, there's no likelihood whatsoever that we're going to bring this up. So I appreciate you calling to our attention, and we're going to get to it if we can, but it's not very likely much will happen this year. There was not a word in that of, I'm so sorry for your loss of your father, and it must be terrible dealing with disease. One sentence to relate to someone, one sentence to show that you have some sense of their humanity can be incredibly powerful. If you want to have some fun long after this, there's a marvelous video called It's Not About the Nail. And I encourage you to watch it. It has a lot to do with gender and couples communication. But the point is, it's not all just about getting the facts and solving the problems. Next, for the next R. The other thing is I shouldn't be responding until I know what the emotional reaction is. Here's reasoning. Reasoning is we think before we respond, which seems obvious, but often we don't. And we think about the wrong things typically. We often think, they said this fact, what is the fact I need to give? They're talking about a legislative issue. I'm going to give them an answer about the legislative issue. But again, perhaps what I need to do is learn more. So I might have, here's an innovative response, just say, tell me more about that. That's how you get more information. Or you can repeat back what they say. So you're very concerned about da, 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 da. You repeat what they said, and then they're allowed and encouraged to respond. But you think not just what is the content, but what does this person need right now? Maybe they need information, and that's great, but maybe they need your support. Maybe they need to know that you're interested in what they're saying. Maybe they need validation. Back on the relating thing earlier, this applies to reasoning as well. Let's suppose you have an angry constituent. The anger may threaten you. Maybe they're literally threatening you, but it may, nobody likes to deal with angry folks generally. Now you may say to yourself, my first goal is to get them to not be angry. But if you think about it, is telling them now calm down going to get an angry person to calm down? Probably not. What might get them to calm down is to say, I can hear that you're angry, and I want to understand what's making you angry and see if there's anything at all I can do to help. And then pause. You're not trying to get them to do what you want. You're trying to say, what do I need to do to help them make sure they're feeling heard? Next question, or next R, responding. So when you're going to respond, you take into account all the other R's. What am I receiving from this person? If I'm relating to them emotionally, what's their emotional state? If I'm thinking about what they need, what are my various possibilities? And again, don't apply your habitual personal response from your lifetime of family and friend communication. Think as a professional, as someone who's caring, who is there to serve. What does this person need? The possible responses are infinite. Your task is to say what this person needs most right now. It's not always about asking questions, getting facts, etc. And it's not even always about saying something. Sometimes the most powerful response is silence. Just listening, but it's not just silence and sitting back like, okay, I'm waiting till you're done. It's paying attention. By the way, before I forget, I mentioned earlier the readiness question. Another how not to do it story about staff is we had a very important meeting, a different issue, an issue I was working on with the tribe that needed recognition. And we were doing a Zoom call with a congressional staffer. You could tell in the call that the staffer was multitasking. As we were trying to convey something incredibly important, the staffer is actually looking at the other screen and periodically looking back at us. No, that's not how you do it. You may multitask. My son can do 7 things while computer gaming and sitting in an online class, but your constituents deserve your 100% attention, 100%, fully on. And if not, your member is going to hear about it because the constituents don't think that they're part of your job. They think at that moment, they are your job. And in fact, they are. So also watch the tone. You know, we can say, oh, I've picked the right words and it's factually accurate, etc. But if you have a condescending tone, if you have a tone that's disrespectful, people will pick up on the tone. They won't have a clue what you said, but they'll know exactly how you said it. So being very cognizant of how you say things. My sister and her family has a marvelous thing they do. If somebody has a condescending or critical statement at the end of what they say, they will fill in the blank for them and say, you idiot. Like if I come home and I say, my wife comes home, or no, yeah, my wife comes home and she was grocery shopping and she doesn't get the milk. And I say, you didn't get the milk? She could fill in for me and say, you idiot, because I have effectively called her an idiot with my tone of voice. And I say, oh, I didn't say that. She'll say, yes, you did. So your tone is hugely important. Now, the last R is repeating. And why do I say that? Sometimes people feel like the one person is going to say something, I'm going to receive it, I'm going to relate to it, I'm going to think about how to respond, and I'm going to respond, and okay, we're done. But no, that's not right. Once I respond, they're going to respond. So I have to, as soon as I'm responding, I have to be ready to receive and relate to their reaction to what I did. So this cycle of communication is ongoing. One quick clinical example, but clinical example. If a patient smokes, a doctor is likely to say, you should quit smoking. The doctor may think, haha, I've done my job as a medical professional. I've told them to quit smoking. The patient never says, oh, thank you, doctor. I never thought of that. No one told me this ever before. I'll quit smoking right now because you're the smartest person I've ever met. Never happens. What they do instead is they say something like, yeah, I've tried to, but I gained weight, or it's hard for me to concentrate, or I find it relaxing and I'm in a stressful job. That response that they just gave you tells you a whole lot more about what the issue is. And if you're ready and receive that response, you can help provide interventions and assistance to dealing with the underlying causes of their smoking. And that can happen also in your political realm. You may give a response and then the person may say, yes, but if this happens, then this. Now you've got additional information, but you would have missed it if you weren't ready to receive what they said in reply. You may want to print this out and don't circulate it, it's copyrighted, but you're welcome to print it out if they give you the slide deck and put it on wherever you're making calls. And every call you make, you say, I mean, literally almost, am I doing these things? Used to compete as a freestyle skier, and I used to instruct skiing, etc. Every single turn, and I make millions of turns a year, I'm asking myself, is my weight forward? Am I on my edges? What leg has got the weight? How am I angulating? Every turn. You can do this with every conversation. The last thing I'll say about this is the times I made the most consequential mistakes in my life as a political person and in my clinical work was when I failed to follow these steps. When I wasn't ready before a conversation, when I didn't receive or think before I spoke, when I wasn't careful about my response, that's when I got into trouble. So follow these if they're helpful, not only in your internship, but hopefully in your personal life as well. I want to last but not least, and do it fairly quickly, talk a little bit about self-care. And the reason I want to do this is because this is a great experience you're about to go through, but as in many great experience, it can be a difficult experience. And sometimes the difficulty is why it's great, because it's challenge you. It makes you grow in new ways. So you need to take care of yourself. But self-care, we typically say, oh, how do I do stress management and all that, which I'm going to talk about. But it's also care for who you are and who you become as a person. You are developing in a very high power world where you can easily lose your sense of who you are, where you can get other priorities in the way of what really matters. And it's important to care for the essence of yourself as well as your physical and emotional well-being. One of the most important questions you can ask in life is, who are you as a person and why are you here? Now, it was before many of your time, but that was ironically how a vice presidential candidate began a debate. Ross Perot's running mate, James Stockwell, began his debate with, who am I? Why am I here? And everybody laughed uproariously because nobody knew who the hell he was or why he was there. But there's actually a big existential question that's quite deep about that. Before you run for office, you better know who you are and you better know why you're there. And the same is true, I think, if you're on a congressional staff. So let's talk about that for a second. A couple points, a few things. Understand that who you are is not defined by your party, even the member you work for or your work, etc. Your character, your decency, what you do for others, that's what makes you a human being. And don't lose sight of that with all the other distractions and temptations, etc. Stay humble. You work as a servant for the people and for others, and be reflective about who you are. You don't have to pretend you're better than somebody or that you know everything. You can't know everything. So don't be embarrassed to ask and to say, you know, I really don't know, but I'll find out. Work ethic. You've got to work super hard in this job because the things you do matter. And you should be insatiably curious. You want to know the answer, not so that you're better than somebody, but so you say, I really want to understand this. And then you must conduct yourself with integrity in an honorable way. And as a checklist, and we're not going to go through the whole thing, but if you put the one slide about communication somewhere on your wall or your desktop, put this one right beside it. Because taking care of yourself is hugely important. It's a high stress, high demanding job. And the idea is this is kind of a checklist I've created to say, ask yourself, am I doing these things? How am I spending my time? Am I actually spending time with my family occasionally, with my friends, on things I enjoy? Am I taking care of my physical body? Do I occasionally during the day get up and breathe and stretch, which looks ridiculous on a Zoom? But I'll tell you what, if you do it 5 times a day, you'll be a whole lot healthier. If you get up between those really difficult calls and just breathe and stretch and walk around, that's going to be a lot better than click to the next Zoom. What are your mental messages? You can get down on the state of the humanity itself and of the world with just looking at negative things. Ask yourself, what is changing about my attitude towards self and humanity and the job and the world? Be aware of your emotions. If you're finding yourself getting down or anxious or angry or despondent, recognize that and then find ways to get some help. There's nothing wrong with getting psychotherapy or counseling. It can be hugely helpful. Keep your relationships. They're hugely important to you and they're easy to lose in this job. The couple of final things: practice mindfulness meditation or your prayer traditions if that's part of your culture. And last but not least, this sounds pedantic and patronizing, but it's not. Alcohol, especially on the Hill, can be an occupational hazard because there's so many receptions, and so that it's what you do after work, et cetera. And I'm not being morally judgmental about this, but be aware, if I'm drinking a lot and I'm starting to come home and I'm not in the kind of shape I need to be, especially if I'm coming to work and I'm not functioning at my highest level, those are things, warning signs that you need to take care of something and change some of that behavior. So a few things. What an amazing experience you're going to have. I think if you apply the self-care model that we've talked about and the communication model, it'll be an even more important experience and valuable. One thing, if I had to advise anybody in life, it would be this: don't overestimate how much you know, but also don't underestimate your ability to learn. That's the humility, but it's also the curiosity and the perseverance element that comes through. And then the last but not least important point is always remember the first rule. Here's what it was. We're all here to serve the public and the nation. So thanks for letting me be with you. And do we have time for questions?
Yes, we certainly do. So folks, if you have some questions, please go ahead and throw them in our Q&A function. We do have about 10, 15 minutes. Dr. Baird, maybe if I can, I'll exercise my kind of host privilege here and kick us off with one. So you mentioned that, again, it happens to us all. Congress is such a fast-paced environment. You mentioned that the mistakes you made were when you forgot some component of the 6 R's. And I remember in my time as an intern, it happens to us all. When I made a mistake, really panicking, thinking I've ruined something for this constituent, I've ruined my chances on the Hill. So can you maybe give us some tips on just how do we use those R's to fix it, to make it better, to make amends when we've made a mistake?
That's really great. It's a wonderful question. A few things. You're right. We're all going to make mistakes. Single most important thing, own it and be honest about it. That's what you've got to do. You've got to be honest in real time if you can. If, let's say you were not listening well to a constituent and they get pissed off at you, as they have kind of a right to do. At that point, you might need to say, it's tempting to get defensive and say, no, I wasn't, blah, blah, blah. Or you may say, you know what? The fact that you're upset suggests maybe I wasn't listening well enough. Let me try it again. Help me understand what you're saying and why this is so important. In other words, I didn't throw the blame back on them. I didn't dodge it. I didn't deny it. I didn't get defensive or aggressive. I said, maybe I didn't listen well enough. Make sure, please tell me, I want to make sure I get it right. And then let me, and I'll repeat it back, but you have to do it in a non-condescending way and literally a kind of an open-hearted way. So too, if you've made a mistake and somebody says, well, F you, and slams the phone down and they're important, you may need to talk to your supervisor and say, I got a constituent out there who's not very happy. And part of the way you need to do that is because the next day when their letter to the editor shows up or the press calls and says, Congressman Baird, we understand that one of your staffers said to a constituent, whatever, it's not a surprise. It's not now scramble around the office and find, that doesn't mean every time someone's angry and calls up, my God, in the current environment in Congress, that's like every 3 minutes. But it does mean if it's somebody's significant, some significant moment, you might just want to say, you know, boss, I maybe didn't handle that well. The other reason to do that, Ann, is because you can learn from the experience. And if you're a supervisor, the supervisor's role should not be to say, oh, now my goal is to make you feel crummy because you screwed up. The supervisor should be in the role of saying, how can we make this a learning experience? So first of all, use the 6 R's and try not to make the mistake. But if you do make a mistake, own it, have a conversation. And if one of your colleagues made a mistake, use the 6 R's to listen. What you said, Anna, is so important. I felt terrible. I thought I'd ruined things. So if you're listening, you're going to pick up not only the what they did that was a mistake, but the how they're feeling about it. And say, oh man, you must feel really crummy about that. And the person's going, oh, I do. And it's so validating to just have someone say the acknowledgement of how it feels to have made a mistake first, then work together to process what to do, rather than be judgmental or just the facts, because the emotionality, as you pointed out, Anne, is just as important.
Absolutely. That is such good advice, and so important for our interns to hear that it's not only relevant for working with constituents, but also with your peers. We've talked a lot in Internapalooza so far about how some of the most important relationships that you're going to develop in this internship are with your peers, are with folks who are on the same trajectory as you, who will be important people in your life going forward. So that's a really great point.
The other thing I just want to say about that is you can pivot back to those 6 R's in real time, meaning I can be in a conversation and I can be like in headspace, whatever. And then I realize real quickly, whoops, I'm skipping R's here. And it sounds kind of trite, but I really can mean it. I've been in conversations and in the middle of I've said to myself, Brian, you're talking content, you're not listening, you're not relating, you're not receiving. And I've literally I mean, the person seeing it doesn't necessarily pick it up, but in my own head, I just completely threw a different switch. I'm in mode 6R, receiving, good communicator, versus whatever the heck other mode I was in. I can switch to that midway. I can correct. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's wonderful. And speaking of kind of switching modes, I know one question we got earlier in Internapalooza was, I think from an intern who'd already taken a few phone shifts and had found out that a lot of constituents just, especially right now in COVID, just really need to talk. And that's fine. Listening is a service, but there's a limit to how long, you have other responsibilities, you have other constituents waiting on the phone. There's a limit to how long you can stay in one call. Do you have any advice for interns who just find themselves really, really just stuck with someone and they need to get off the phone for whatever reason, and want to do it respectfully in a way that's like you said, not condescending and not discouraging for the constituent?
Yeah, and this is going to sound cynical or paradoxical, and I don't mean it to be either. The more people feel heard, the less they'll feel the need to be heard. And so if you can focus on relating and really receiving early on, that sense of needing to be heard will be fulfilled more rapidly. I've done this with state legislators, and they've said, I don't think I have time for this. I've had attorneys that say, I don't have time for this. We bill by the hour. And I've said, well, let's think about how much time it takes. Person comes in, they've got a problem. You could jump right into problem solving mode. But if they need to feel heard first, and you need to say something like, let's say somebody's calling about COVID and their loved one is terribly sick, or they're afraid they're going to lose their job, or they have lost their job. You could jump straight in to say, well, we've passed HR blah, 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 which provides this support for rent relief, this support for unemployment insurance, blah, blah, blah. And the congressperson voted this way, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But you didn't hear how they felt. If you just said something like, that's got to be terribly difficult. I'm very sorry you're going through that. Help me understand more, and I'll see if there's anything we can do. I got right to the emotionality of that. And then I said, we'll see if there's anything we can do. Now they're probably going to go into problem solving mode with you because they felt heard to begin with. Now, at some point, then you can close out a conversation by repeating. Remember, these R's repeat, right? By going back to, I so appreciate you called today. And I understand, and you can't always say understand, because people say, how the hell can you understand? You've got a job, you've got blah, blah. But I've heard, and I appreciate you sharing with me, and I can imagine that it's very, very difficult. So I'll convey that to the congressman, because they'll care a great deal about it. And I hope I've shared this information with you. If you need more help, please put it in writing and drop me a note or us a note at blah, 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 blah. But if you repeat, and you do this, customer service reps do it all the time on the phone. At the start, they repeat what your problem is. At the end, they say back, now I hope I've helped you resolve your inability to use Windows 11 because your computer doesn't have enough memory, whatever. But they're doing that for a reason, because they want to make sure they get it right to begin with and that they got it right when they're closing.
That is so helpful. I wish I had heard that much earlier when I was an intern. I really appreciate that, Dr. Baird. Folks, just a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We have a few more minutes and we'll be happy to take other questions. But in the meantime, I wonder if I could kind of go back to that idea of repeating and just kind of building trust in that relationship. So I know for a lot of interns, you'll talk to kind of repeat, frequent flyers, repeat callers, and sometimes you really get to develop a relationship with a constituent who calls frequently, who has a long-term problem. And I think one of the hardest things for interns when they develop those relationships is handing them off when it's time for them to leave that off. I wonder if you could just share any tips you have for if you have to hand a constituent off to someone else that you've built up a relationship with, whether it's a staffer, the next intern, whoever, how to do that again with respect and kind of keeping that trust relationship alive.
Well, yeah, and that raises another issue that I also want to address, Ann, and it's this, and it's really important. There's a thing called compassion fatigue, which means when you're listening or interacting all day long with people in need, you can have what's called secondary traumatization, which is if you're listening to their trauma, you can feel traumatized as well. It's not like, oh, I'm owning your trauma, but it's more like it has an impact to hear stories of people in need. And compassion fatigue happens when it's day after day, patient after patient after patient. It's hard to maintain that sense of presence, and it affects you and can wear you down. You get tired of this. Imagine all the COVID fighting nurses and doctors and healthcare professionals 2 years into a pandemic, they're burned out. And the same is true of many other service workers, including members of Congress and their staff. It's hard to bear that burden. The other thing is there's a sense of, I'm here to fix things, and sometimes I can't fix them. And that can make you feel helpless. It can make you angry and frustrated, and you just want to scream. These people need something, and I can't help them. It breaks my heart. So being aware that you have that experience can be hugely important. The other thing is when you're making the transition, it's really important to be respectful. And this is subtle. It's subtle, and we're all human, so we're all going to sometimes be not as respectful as we should. But sometimes in clinical realms, like psychiatric hospitals or group homes, staff can get a kind of an attitude of cynicism, and they can find themselves being very critical of the patients. Oh yeah, look what he's doing again. And they forget, wait, these are your patients, your clients, they're human beings in need. Now, not that they're not pains in the ass sometimes, and not that they're not difficult, and not that it's not frustrating, but keeping that sense of trying to be respectful and conveying that to your colleague if you're handing the case off or transferring the case. I've been working with Mr. Jones for 12 years now, and believe me, we've sometimes had cases that have gone that long. We started here, here's the file, this is what we've done, here's where it is. This is what I find he needs most. And sometimes you've got the most wonderful people who have really huge, profound needs. And we've worked with people who had literally life and death issues that we could not solve. But at the end of the conversation, they said, Congressman, I know you can't solve this, but it means the world to me that you listen and you try. Don't underestimate the value of that.
Absolutely, that is hugely important. And let me circle back actually to your point about just what members of Congress and their staffs have been dealing with. I think particularly in the pandemic and after January 6th, but in general over the last few years, we've talked about this elsewhere in Internapalooza, that interns may be working with staffers who are dealing with that compassion fatigue and dealing with that burnout. So do you have any advice for interns who are working with staff where the intern just realizes, it seems like my supervisor is just really burned out and I'm having trouble communicating. I'm having trouble getting the support that I feel like I need. Is there anything I can do to help them? Any advice for interns in that situation?
It's a great question, and it sounds convenient and maybe even trite, but it's not. It's actually quite powerful. Use the 6 R's. relate to the person you're talking to at every level. Like it can even, your member of Congress is a human being too. They're under stresses. And if your supervisor's seeming harried, there's nothing wrong with saying, man, you must be exhausted. What a tough day you've had. Or I heard you had a really tough call. I'm really sorry about that. Humanizing our colleagues and our supervisors and our employees and our direct reports is one of the most important things we can do. And that sometimes means we're cutting them slack. Sometimes means they're not the perfect supervisor or the perfect colleague. And we don't necessarily take it personally. We relate to them and say, you know what? They get a freebie on this one because they just had a crummy day or they've had a crummy week. You can also, though, in that process, express your own feelings. It's like, there's nothing wrong in a communication with talking about your own feelings so the other person can relate to you, to say, I'm exhausted myself, or I'm embarrassed. Now, that's not the same as sort of stealing their space. Somebody says, I'm tired, and you go, oh yeah, me too. Let me tell you about how tired I am. This is more being respectful of where they're at, but at some point when you've really been present and listened and received that and related to it, if there's appropriate for you to share your own emotional situation, that's fine, especially if you're struggling. If you're proactively going to a supervisor and say, I got to share with you, boss, I am going through some hard times right now. Maybe it's, you don't usually want to get super personal, but maybe it's some aspects of the job that are really tiring. I'm dealing with so many patients, or crossover there, so many constituents who are in so much need, and I'm frustrated by that. Or I have a hard time dealing with people who are angry all the time, or whatever. Nothing wrong with sharing how you're feeling in that process.
Absolutely. And that's such good advice. Just keep that open line of communication with your supervisor and just how to do it. Again, like you said, productively and respectfully. I think we have time for probably maybe one or two more questions. So I wonder if I can kind of maybe ask a little bit more of a personal question and just ask, you've been working in and around Congress you served for over 12 years. You've been working to support staff and interns in the institution. What keeps your faith in Congress?
Well, in the end, human beings are decent. Most human beings, they can be horrible. We've seen horrific examples throughout history and recently in our own country. But we have to have faith and a commitment and integrity and compassion to carry through. And maintaining that positivity is hugely important. And a tiny aside, I'm working to establish a national museum and center for service to honor all forms of service, not just military service, which is powerful and profound, and we must honor it. But there are lots of other ways to serve. Service like you provide, like the folks on this call, the interns, the government employees, the doctors, nurses, teachers, firefighters, first responders, the whole panoply of people. As we speak, all around the country and all around the world, Americans are doing good things. They're fighting diseases, they're battling droughts, they're rescuing refugees, they're helping people in disaster areas all over the world, sometimes in the most dire circumstances. And that sense of human decency and compassion and kindness, you just can't lose sight of that. There are angry, mean-spirited, bigoted, racist, homophobic, nasty folks out there, that's for sure. But there are lots of people who transcend that, dig deep, and give to others on a daily basis. And if we're with that group, and that's who we are inside, it's its own reward. And that in the end, I believe, humanity makes progress. There are setbacks, sometimes terrifyingly profound setbacks. But if we carry that in ourselves and nurture it in others, things are likely to work out better.
And what a wonderful place to end it. Dr. Baird, we cannot thank you enough for joining us today and sharing this wisdom and these great tips for interns to handle anything that this internship and anything afterwards can throw at them. So thank you again so much for your time, Dr. Baird. A pleasure.
My pleasure. Good luck to everyone. Work hard. Have fun.